Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine waking up tomorrow, not in your comfortable bed, but on a thin straw mattress crawling with lice. The year is 1858. You are in London, the greatest city the world has ever known, heart of the British Empire, workshop of nations. Outside your narrow window, the sun struggles to penetrate a thick yellow fog that tastes of coal and copper. Your throat burns with every breath. Welcome to Industrial Revolution London, where the air itself is poison, the water brings death, and every moment is a battle for survival. Tonight, we're going to walk together through the streets of this city, breathing its toxic atmosphere, drinking its contaminated water, working in its merciless factories. We're going to understand, viscerally, why the average person living in the London of the mid-1800s faced challenges so extreme that they would break most modern souls within hours. This isn't a story of progress triumphant. It's a story of human endurance in the face of conditions that transformed a great city into what some called hell on earth. So, settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey to a place where simply breathing, drinking, eating, or going to work could be your last act on this mortal plane. The Awakening. You wake before dawn in a single room that houses not just you, but your entire family. 6 people sharing perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet of space. The walls weep with condensation, black mold blooming in every corner like a grotesque garden. There are no windows that open, only a single pane of glass so grimy that daylight, when it comes, arrives as a sickly gray smudge. Your first breath is labored. The air in this room is thick and foul, heavy with the exhalations of too many bodies in too small a space, with the smell of the chamber pot that sits in the corner, with something else you can't quite name, a sort of sweet sick odor of decay that seems to seep from the very walls. This is the Rookery, the London slum, where by 1850 the poorest families were crammed into buildings that had once housed single wealthy households. Now, divided and subdivided, each room rented to a different family, these structures had become vertical warrens of human misery. You share this building with perhaps 40 other souls, all of them fighting the same desperate daily battle for existence. The walls are so thin you can hear your neighbors coughing, a wet, rattling sound that goes on and on. Tuberculosis, the White Plague. It killed more people than any other disease in Victorian England, roughly 1 in every 3 deaths. In these overcrowded conditions, where families shared beds and air and germs circulated like currency, it spread like wildfire through dry grass. But tuberculosis would be a slow death, measured in months or years of wasting away. The immediate threat, the thing that could kill you today, starts the moment you step out of this fetid room and into the street. The air outside is worse, so much worse than anything you've ever experienced. The air you cannot breathe. Picture, if you can, a fog so thick you cannot see your hand in front of your face. But this is not the gentle morning mist of the countryside. This is the London fog of 1858, a creation part natural moisture and part industrial poison. They called it a pea super for its thick yellow-green color. It tasted of sulfur and coal smoke. It coated your tongue, lined your throat, and settled in your lungs like wet cement. The source of this atmospheric nightmare was coal. London, by the middle of the 19th century, burned millions of tons of coal every year. Every home, every factory, every workshop had its chimney belching thick black smoke into the already stagnant air. Coal heated homes in the brutal winters. Coal powered the new steam engines that drove industry. Coal was burned in such massive quantities that the very sky turned dark. Scientists would later discover that London's air during this period contained particulate matter at levels that would be considered catastrophic by any modern standard. The amount of suspended soot and ash in the atmosphere had doubled over 2 centuries, from the 1700s to the 1900s. Every breath you took drew this filth deep into your lungs. Your body had no defense against it. The tiny particles, far too small for your nose and throat to filter out, would lodge in the delicate tissue of your lungs and stay there, accumulating over months and years. The respiratory diseases that resulted were legion. Factory workers, who spent their days in enclosed spaces filled with cotton dust, coal smoke, and chemical fumes, developed what they simply called factory cough. It was a permanent condition, a slow suffocation that progressed year by year until breathing itself became an act of will. Children born into this atmosphere never knew what it meant to take a deep, clean breath. By the time they reached adolescence, many already had lungs that functioned at half capacity. But the air pollution wasn't just uncomfortable or unhealthy. During what became known as the Great Smog events, it was actively lethal. People collapsed in the streets, unable to breathe. The elderly and the very young died in their beds, their lungs simply giving out under the assault. Even healthy adults found themselves gasping, their eyes streaming, their chests burning with every labored inhalation. You step out into this air, and immediately you understand something fundamental about Industrial Revolution London. The city itself was hostile to human life. The very atmosphere had become toxic, and there was nowhere to escape it. Rich and poor alike breathed this poison, though the wealthy could at least retreat to their country estates when the smog grew too thick. The poor had no such luxury. They stayed, they breathed, they sickened, they died. And the air, as terrible as it was not even the worst of it, the water of death. By mid-morning, you were thirsty. Your throat, already irritated by the coal-laden air, desperately needs water. In your time, this would be simple. Turn a tap, fill a glass, drink. But here, in 1858 London, getting water means making a choice that could kill you. The Thames. The great river that had sustained London for 2,000 years had, by the middle of the 19th century, become the largest open sewer in the world. Every day, 90 million gallons of raw sewage flowed into its waters, and from those same waters, 500 million gallons were drawn daily to supply the city's drinking needs. Let that sink in for a moment. The water you would drink today had, quite possibly, been sewage yesterday. The city had roughly 200,000 cesspits, underground tanks where human waste collected. When these overflowed, which they did constantly in this city of millions, their contents flowed into the storm drains, which emptied into the Thames. When the new flushing toilets became popular among those who could afford them, they simply added to the volume of waste pouring into the river. The water companies that supplied London drew their water from different points along the Thames. The Lambeth Water Company drew from upstream, above Teddington Lock, where the water was relatively clean. The Southwark and Vauxhall Company, however, drew their water from the most polluted stretch of the river, right in the heart of the city where all the sewers emptied. If you lived in an area serviced by Southwark and Vauxhall, you were 6 times more likely to contract cholera than your neighbors supplied by Lambeth. Cholera. The word struck terror into Victorian hearts like few others. It had arrived in London in 1831, this terrible disease from Asia, and it returned in waves throughout the century. 1832 saw the first major outbreak, over 6,000 dead in London alone. 1848 to 49 brought another epidemic, over 14,000 dead across the outbreak. 1853 to 54 saw a third outbreak, killing over 10,000 more in London. The disease was horrifying in its speed and brutality. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. The symptoms were graphic and undignified. Violent diarrhea and vomiting that dehydrated the body so rapidly that victims' skin turned blue, their eyes sank into their skulls, their bodies shriveled. They called it the Blue Death. Medical science of the time had no cure, and for most of the period, no understanding of how it spread. The prevailing theory was miasma, the belief that diseases were carried by foul-smelling air, by the bad vapors that rose from rotting organic matter. This theory, while completely wrong, made a certain terrible sense in the context of Victorian London. The city reeked. The Thames, especially in the hot summer months, produced a stench so overwhelming that it drove people indoors, made them retch. made members of Parliament abandon the newly rebuilt Houses of Parliament because the smell from the river was unbearable. The summer of 1858 brought the crisis to a head. Temperatures soared into the 90s, week after week of punishing heat. The Thames, already thick with sewage, began to cook in the sun. The water level dropped, exposing banks of human waste that fermented in the heat. The smell was described as pestilential, a perfect disgrace to the nation, beyond all language to describe. They called it the Great Stink. Parliament, forced to sit next to this reeking river, finally took action. They soaked the curtains in chloride of lime, attempting to mask the smell. It didn't work. Members debated relocating to Oxford or Edinburgh, anywhere but London. In desperation, they dumped 200 to 250 tons of lime per week into the river, at a cost of £1,500 weekly, which would be tens of thousands in today's money. That didn't work either. The Great Stink finally accomplished what years of cholera deaths had not. It spurred the government to action. Within 18 days, Parliament passed legislation funding a comprehensive sewer system designed by engineer Joseph Basil Gett. His network of underground tunnels would intercept sewage before it reached the Thames and carry it downstream, far beyond the city. The project would take 17 years to complete, from 1859 to 1875, but when finished, it transformed London from the filthiest city in the world to one of the cleanest. But in 1858, you don't have Basil Gett's sewers. You have a choice between drinking water that might contain literal sewage or dying of thirst. Most people, most days, took their chances with the water. Some boiled it first, if they could afford the coal. Many didn't. They drank, they prayed, and they hoped that today would not be the day cholera found them. And even if you survived the water, even if somehow you managed to breathe the toxic air and avoid the waterborne diseases, you still face the most fundamental challenge of all: finding food that wouldn't poison you. The daily bread of poison hunger gnaws at your stomach. You have a few pennies, earned through backbreaking labor we'll discuss shortly, and you need to buy food. In your time, this would be safe. Food is regulated, inspected, labeled, not here. Here, in Industrial Revolution London, the food itself is another form of Russian roulette. Bread was the staff of life for Victorian workers. A family of 6 might consume 55 pounds of bread per week. It was cheap, filling, available. The problem was that much of it was adulterated with substances that ranged from harmless to deadly. White bread was especially prized, seen as more refined, more pure, more suitable for respectable people than the darker brown loaves. Bakers knew this, and they knew that truly white bread required expensive, high-quality flour. So they found cheaper alternatives. They added chalk, they added plaster of Paris, they added ground bone meal, they added alum. Alum deserved special attention because it was the adulterant of choice throughout much of the Victorian period. This aluminum-based compound had several advantages from a dishonest baker's perspective. It was cheap, it was readily available, it had no taste, it made bread whiter, and because it was denser than flour, it increased the weight of the loaf. Since bread was sold by weight, typically as quarter-pound loaves, this meant more profit. What alum did to the human body was less advantageous. It acted as an astringent, irritating the stomach lining. It interfered with digestion, reducing the body's ability to extract nutrients from other foods. In an era of widespread malnutrition, when many working-class families were already barely getting enough to eat, bread that actively prevented the absorption of nutrients was a silent killer. For children, the effects were particularly devastating. Alum could cause chronic diarrhea, which in young children often led to severe dehydration and death. By the 1870s, investigations found that half of all bread sampled in London contained considerable quantities of alum. If you were a child whose diet consisted primarily of bread and milk, and your bread irritated your stomach while your milk was mostly water, your chances of reaching adulthood were frighteningly slim. In 1858, the prominent physician John Snow, the same man who would help prove that cholera was waterborne, proposed that the widespread prevalence of rickets, a bone-softening disease epidemic among Victorian children, was linked to the alum in their bread. While this specific connection was later questioned, it highlighted a broader truth. The food that sustained life was also, often, slowly taking it away. And bread was hardly the only adulterated food. Milk, that other staple of the Victorian diet, and especially important for children, was routinely watered down. Investigations in 1882 found that 1/5 of all milk samples contained excessive water or chalk. That same investigation found that 10% of all butter was adulterated with foreign substances. Tea, that most British of beverages, was recycled. Dried tea leaves were re-dried, dyed, and sold again. Sometimes tree or shrub leaves were mixed in to bulk up the product. Coffee was cut with ground acorns or chicory. Beer and rum were fortified with strychnine when watered down to restore their kick. Pickled foods and preserves were colored with copper sulfate, giving them an appealing green hue while slowly poisoning consumers with accumulated heavy metals. Sweets and confectionery for children were colored with some of the most toxic substances imaginable. Chromate of lead created a beautiful deep yellow, but caused lead poisoning that accumulated with each exposure. One incident in 1858 in the town of Bradford demonstrated just how deadly this could be. A batch of sweets accidentally adulterated with arsenic trioxide instead of the intended powdered gypsum killed around 20 people and poisoned over 200 more. 5 pounds of sweets caused 20 deaths. The cynical economics behind all this adulteration were simple. Millers and bakers, many of them barely surviving financially themselves, were under constant pressure to cut costs. If they could replace expensive flour with cheap chalk, they did. If they could water down milk and restore its appearance with chalk or borax, they did. Every level of the food supply chain involved someone desperate enough to add something that shouldn't be there. And the cumulative effect was a population that was chronically malnourished and regularly poisoned by the very food that should have sustained them. Regulations existed technically. The Adulteration of Food or Drink Act of 1860 made it illegal to sell food mixed with injurious ingredients or to pass off adulterated food as pure. But the law was toothless. Penalties were minimal, mere 5-pound fines that were not enough to deter anyone. Enforcement was spotty at best. It wasn't until the 1870s and 80s, with amended acts that created mandatory public analysts and factory inspectors with real power, that the tide began to turn. But in 1858, you're buying your loaf of bread, and you have no way of knowing whether it will nourish you or sicken you. You eat because you must eat or die, and you hope. Hope is perhaps the most abundant commodity in Victorian London. Into the factory, the house of pain. You've survived the morning, breathing poison, drinking potential death, eating uncertain nourishment. Now comes the truly dangerous part of your day, going to work. If you're an adult male laborer, you might work 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. If you're a woman or child, the hours are often just as long, though your wages will be a fraction of what men earn. You might work in a textile mill, a match factory, a coal mine, an iron foundry, a chemical works. Each comes with its own specific horrors, but certain realities are universal: danger, exhaustion, and the constant threat of injury or death. Let's say you work in a textile mill. You arrive as dawn breaks, though you can barely tell through the perpetual gloom. The factory is a massive brick structure, story upon story of it, filled with machinery that never stops. The noise hits you like a physical force the moment you enter. Hundreds of spinning machines, power looms, all driven by a massive steam engine, create a cacophony so intense that workers often go deaf within years. Shouting is useless. Workers communicate through signs and lip reading. The air inside makes the polluted air outside seem fresh by comparison. Cotton dust fills the atmosphere, so thickly you can see it, a white fog that coats everything and everyone. With each breath, you draw this dust deep into your lungs. Over months and years, it accumulates there, causing what doctors called grinder's disease, or factory lung, a progressive condition that made breathing increasingly difficult until victims essentially suffocated. The temperature is oppressive. The steam engines that drive the machinery produce incredible heat, and the close-packed bodies of hundreds of workers add to it. In summer, temperatures inside can reach 100 degrees or more. Workers faint regularly. Some never wake up, but the heat and noise and dust are just the baseline misery. The real danger comes from the machinery itself. These are not the carefully guarded, safety-equipped machines of modern times. These are exposed gears, unshielded spinning wheels, rapidly moving belts and chains, all operating at speeds that could tear flesh from bone in an instant. And you work among them, around them, sometimes under them. If you're a child, and child labor was ubiquitous in Victorian factories, your job might be that of a scavenger. This meant crawling under the operating machinery to pick up stray bits of cotton, or to clean accumulated lint from the moving parts. The machines were never stopped for this. If you moved too slowly, if you miscalculated by even a few inches, the machinery could catch your clothing, your hair, your hand. What followed was swift and merciless. Factory records from the period make for grim reading. Children scalped when their hair caught in spinning machines. Children crushed when they fell asleep under machinery and it started moving. Children with fingers torn off, hands mangled, arms severed. And these weren't rare occurrences. They were routine enough that they barely made it into official reports unless the child died outright. Older children and adults worked as piecers, responsible for repairing broken threads on the spinning machines. This required leaning over rapidly spinning equipment, your fingers moving with desperate speed to tie the threads before the machine came back around. Many workers lost fingers, some lost entire hands. Factory owners saw these injuries as an acceptable cost of doing business, a risk inherent in manufacturing that workers should simply accept. There were no workers' compensation laws. If you were injured, you were simply replaced. If the injury prevented you from working, you and your family faced starvation. This created a perverse incentive. Workers would hide injuries, would work while sick or hurt, because stopping meant losing their job and with it their ability to survive. In match factories, the dangers were more insidious. Young women and girls were employed to dip matches into white phosphorus, a substance that created a beautiful flame but also happened to be highly toxic. Repeated exposure caused a condition called phossy jaw, where the phosphorus would begin to literally rot the jawbone. The symptoms were horrific. The jaw would glow in the dark, emit a foul smell, and eventually have to be removed if the victim survived long enough. Many didn't. The phosphorus poisoning often proved fatal. Coal mines presented perhaps the worst conditions of all. Children as young as 5 were sent down into the darkness, strapped to carts filled with coal, forced to pull them on hands and knees through passages too narrow for adults. They worked 12 to 18 hours a day in nearly complete darkness, breathing coal dust that would ensure they never lived to old age. The mines were poorly ventilated. Black lung disease and other respiratory conditions were nearly universal among miners. Cave-ins and explosions were frequent enough to be unremarkable. The Factory Acts, passed gradually throughout the Victorian period, attempted to address these horrors. The Cotton Mills Act of 1819 prohibited children under 9 from working in cotton mills and limited those under 16 to 12 hours a day. The Factory Act of 1833 lowered the age to 8, but limited 9 to 13-year-olds to 9 hours daily and 48 hours weekly. The Factory Act of 1844 limited women and young adults to 12-hour days. The 10 Hours Bill of 1847 made it law that women and young people work no more than 10 hours daily. But laws on paper meant little when enforcement was minimal and employers could easily evade them. Factory inspectors were few and easily bribed or intimidated. Children's ages were difficult to verify before birth registration became mandatory in 1836, and even then, false papers were easy to obtain. The laws improved slowly, incrementally, but for most of the Victorian period, the factory remained a place where human beings were ground down as surely as the raw materials they processed. By the time your workday ends, somewhere between 7 and 9 in the evening, you are barely human. Your body aches from the repetitive motions and the constant standing. Your hands are bleeding from small cuts and abrasions. Your lungs burn from the dust. Your ears ring from the noise. Your stomach growls because the single break you received gave you barely enough time to choke down some bread and weak tea. And tomorrow, you will do it all again. And the day after that. And the day after that, until your body breaks down entirely, or an accident claims you, or some disease finds you weakened and vulnerable. The plague that never ended. Walk through any Victorian cemetery, and you'll notice something that modern eyes find almost unbearable. The children's graves. Row after row of small headstones, many marking the resting places of infants who never saw their first birthday. In the London of 1850, infant mortality rates varied widely, but in the worst slum areas could reach frightening levels. Liverpool, one of England's most notorious cities, for high mortality, recorded infant mortality rates of around 24% in the 1850s, meaning nearly 1 in 4 children died before reaching their first birthday. The causes of death recorded in Victorian records read like a catalog of horrors. Cholera, as we've discussed, tuberculosis, the great killer, but also typhoid, smallpox, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough. Diseases that we've forgotten or conquered through vaccination were epidemic killers in 19th century London. Diphtheria was particularly dreaded. The disease formed a thick membrane in the throat that slowly suffocated its victims, usually children. Mothers would watch helplessly as their babies struggled for breath, their faces turning blue until merciful death released them. There was no treatment, no cure, only the terrible wait to see if the child's body could fight off the infection or would succumb. Scarlet fever swept through neighborhoods in waves, leaving dead children in its wake. Typhoid, spread by contaminated water and food, caused high fever, severe digestive distress, and often death, particularly in the weak and malnourished. Smallpox, before vaccination became widespread, killed and disfigured thousands. The survivors often bore pockmarked faces as permanent reminders of their ordeal. But it was tuberculosis that killed more than any other disease, roughly 1/3 of all disease deaths in the Victorian era. It was called consumption because it seemed to consume its victims from within, wasting away their flesh, draining their strength, filling their lungs with blood. It spread easily in the overcrowded, poorly ventilated conditions of London slums. Entire families would be wiped out, one member after another succumbing to the same infection. Medical understanding of these diseases was primitive at best, and actively harmful at worst. The miasma theory dominated medical thinking for much of the period. Doctors believed diseases were spread by bad air, by the smell of decay and filth. This led to some beneficial interventions like improved sanitation and better ventilation. But it also meant that the actual mechanisms of disease transmission through contaminated water and person-to-person contact were misunderstood or ignored. Treatment options were limited and often dangerous in themselves. Bloodletting, the practice of deliberately draining blood from a patient to balance the humors, persisted well into the Victorian era despite doing more harm than good. Mercury compounds were used to treat syphilis, often causing more damage than the disease itself. Opium and laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, were freely available and used to treat everything from teething pain in infants to chronic coughs in adults, creating widespread addiction. The life expectancy figures for Victorian London tell the story in stark numbers. In the mid-1800s, average life expectancy at birth for London hovered around 36 to 40 years. In 1850, it was approximately 40 years for men and 42 for women. This doesn't mean that everyone died young. Many who survived the dangerous years of childhood lived to reasonably old age. But it does mean that an enormous proportion of the population died young, pulling the average down dramatically. And the class disparities were shocking. A professional man in a wealthy district might expect to live past 50. A laborer in an industrial slum might not see 40. The difference wasn't genetic or inevitable. It was environmental, caused by the air they breathed, the water they drank, the food they ate, the conditions in which they worked, and the medical care they could or couldn't afford. Infant mortality particularly reflected these disparities. In prosperous neighborhoods with better sanitation and access to cleaner water, infant mortality rates were lower, though still terrible by modern standards. In the worst slums, rates could be devastatingly high. The class divide in mortality was stark and undeniable, with working-class districts experiencing death rates many times higher than wealthy areas. The causes were multiple and overlapping. Malnutrition weakened mothers and babies alike. Adulterated milk and food sickened infants. Contaminated water caused diarrheal diseases that dehydrated babies with shocking speed. Close living conditions spread infectious diseases rapidly. And poverty meant that when a child fell ill, medical care was often too expensive or too far away to make a difference. Maternal mortality was also shockingly high. Childbirth, in an era before antiseptic techniques were understood or practiced, was extraordinarily dangerous. Puerperal fever, a bacterial infection of the uterus after childbirth, killed thousands of new mothers. Doctors and midwives, not understanding the importance of washing their hands and sterilizing instruments, would go from autopsy room to delivery room, carrying death with them. It's difficult to convey to modern minds, accustomed to antibiotics and vaccines and clean water, just how precarious life was in Victorian London. Every day carried the possibility that some illness would strike you or your children. Every minor cut or scrape could become infected and turn fatal. Every sip of water, every bite of food, every breath of air carried potential danger. The psychological toll of this constant mortality was immense. Victorian families were larger, partly because parents knew they would lose some children and needed to have more to ensure that some survived to adulthood. Mourning became an elaborate ritual, especially after Prince Albert's death in 1861, when Queen Victoria's extended mourning set the tone for the entire nation. But beneath the ritual was genuine, repeated grief. Few adults reached middle age without having buried at least one child, and many buried several. The divided city. There was another London, invisible to those trapped in the slums and factories. It existed on the same streets, sometimes in the same neighborhoods, but it might as well have been another planet. This was the London of the wealthy and middle classes. Their homes had windows that opened, letting in light and air. They had multiple rooms, space for each function of living. They had servants to haul water, to empty chamber pots, to cook food, to clean. They didn't work in factories breathing poison for 16 hours a day. They didn't drink water drawn from the polluted Thames. Their water came from private wells or was boiled and filtered. The contrast was sometimes literally visible on the same street. A grand townhouse might stand next to a tenement housing 40 people. The residents of the townhouse would step over beggars on their way to a carriage that would carry them to the opera or a fine restaurant. The working poor, meanwhile, would walk miles to their jobs because they couldn't afford the omnibus fare. This divide created profound social tensions. The wealthy saw poverty as a moral failing, evidence of laziness or weak character. The idea that circumstances beyond individual control, that systemic issues like low wages and terrible working conditions might trap people in poverty, was largely foreign to Victorian thinking. Charity existed, but it was often grudging and judgmental, more concerned with ensuring that the poor were deserving than with actually alleviating suffering. The workhouse system exemplified this attitude. Created by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, workhouses were intended to provide relief to those who couldn't support themselves. But they were deliberately designed to be as unpleasant as possible, to discourage people from seeking help. Families were separated upon entry, men from women, parents from children. The food was minimal and unpleasant. The work assigned was often pointless, like breaking rocks or picking oakum, designed purely to be exhausting and demeaning. the terror that working people felt toward the workhouse was profound. It represented the absolute bottom, the place you went when everything else had failed. Many preferred to starve in the streets rather than enter its doors. The separation of families was particularly cruel. Parents might never see their children again if they were forced to enter the workhouse. Debtors' prisons, though gradually being phased out during the Victorian period, still existed for much of it. Owing money was a criminal offense. If you couldn't pay your debts, you could be imprisoned, which of course made it even more impossible to earn money to pay those debts. Families were sometimes imprisoned together, living in squalid conditions within the prison walls, the children growing up behind bars for their parents' financial failures. The class divide extended to every aspect of life. The wealthy worried about fashion and social events. The poor worried about having enough to eat. The wealthy saw doctors regularly. The poor died of treatable conditions because they couldn't afford medical care. The wealthy children were educated by tutors and governesses. The poor children worked in factories if they were fortunate enough to have jobs. This wasn't a society with anything resembling a safety net. There was no unemployment insurance, no disability pay, no government health care, no public assistance beyond the dreaded workhouse. If you couldn't work, you starved. If you were injured, you were on your own. If you fell ill, you either recovered through your own body's strength or you died. The idea that society had any responsibility to care for its weakest members was radical and largely rejected by those in power. The breaking of the mind. We've talked about the physical horrors of Industrial Revolution London, the toxic air, the contaminated water, the poisoned food, the lethal workplaces, the constant threat of disease. But there was another dimension to the suffering, one less visible but no less destructive: the psychological toll. Imagine living every day on the edge of disaster. One injury, one illness, one economic downturn could mean the difference between barely surviving and total destitution. The constant stress, the grinding poverty, the endless exhaustion, the regular loss of loved ones, the hopelessness of seeing no way out. All of this took a profound toll on mental health. Victorian society didn't have the language or framework to discuss mental health in the way we do today, but the evidence of its impact is everywhere in the historical record. Alcoholism was epidemic, cheap gin was readily available, and for people whose lives were an unending march of misery, the temporary oblivion it offered was nearly irresistible. They called it mother's ruin because so many women, trapped in desperate circumstances, turned to it for relief. Opium and laudanum were equally prevalent. These substances were legal, easily obtained, and widely used not just for pain relief, but for escaping the psychological burden of Victorian life. Mothers gave it to their babies to keep them quiet while they worked. Adults used it to dull the constant ache of their existence. The addiction that resulted simply added another layer of suffering to already unbearable lives. Suicide rates were high, though often disguised in official records. A death by drowning in the Thames might be recorded as an accident, but many were deliberate. A mother who couldn't feed her children, a father who had lost his job and couldn't support his family, a young woman facing the workhouse. Despair drove many to choose death over continuing to struggle. The asylums of Victorian London were nightmarish places where those deemed lunatic or insane were locked away in conditions that often worsened their conditions rather than helping them. The understanding of mental illness was primitive and often cruel. Treatments ranged from the merely useless to the actively harmful: cold water baths, physical restraints, isolation, beatings. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the psychological toll was the way it became normalized. This level of suffering, this constant grind of poverty and danger and death, became seen as simply the way things were. People accepted it because they had no choice but to accept it. The wealthy looked at the poor and saw their suffering as inevitable, as perhaps even necessary for the functioning of society. The poor themselves often internalized these views, seeing their circumstances as their own fault, as divine punishment, as something to be endured rather than changed. The few who had the energy and organization to resist, to form unions and demand better conditions, faced enormous opposition. Strikes were often met with violence. Labor organizers were arrested. The full weight of law and social disapproval came down on those who dared to suggest that perhaps workers deserved better than to be ground into dust by the industrial machine. And yet, resistance happened, slowly, incrementally, through the efforts of reformers, labor activists, investigative journalists, and sympathetic politicians. Things began to change. The Factory Acts, however imperfect, did improve conditions for some workers. The Public Health Acts led to better sanitation and cleaner water. The gradual expansion of the franchise gave working people a political voice they'd never had before. The slow dawn. We've walked through a day in Industrial Revolution London, and if you're feeling overwhelmed, exhausted, perhaps a bit sick to your stomach, that's appropriate. The reality of life for ordinary people in Victorian London was almost unimaginably hard. The air they breathed was poison. The water they drank could kill them. The food they ate was often adulterated or contaminated. The work they did destroyed their bodies. Disease was everywhere. Death a constant companion. But this story isn't just about suffering. It's also about resilience, about the incredible capacity of human beings to endure and to slowly, painfully build something better. By the late Victorian period, things were beginning to improve. Bazalgette's sewer system, completed in 1875, dramatically reduced waterborne disease. The cholera epidemics that had terrorized London for decades essentially ended after the sewers were built. Clean water became available to more and more people as the understanding of germ theory spread and water treatment became standard practice. The Factory Acts, repeatedly strengthened throughout the period, did eventually create real protections for workers. Child labor, while not eliminated overnight, was gradually restricted and regulated. The minimum age for work crept upward. Maximum hours were reduced. Safety requirements, though still minimal by modern standards, began to be enforced with some consistency. The Adulteration of Food Act of 1872, and particularly the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, created the framework for food safety regulation that would eventually make the poisoning of the population through their daily bread no longer acceptable business practice. Public analysts were appointed to test foods, and penalties for adulteration became severe enough to actually deter the practice. Medical science advanced dramatically in the latter half of the 19th century. The acceptance of germ theory, pioneered by Louis Pasteur and others, revolutionized understanding of disease. Joseph Lister's introduction of antiseptic surgery in the 1860s transformed surgical outcomes. Vaccination against smallpox became widespread. By the end of the Victoria era, life expectancy had begun to climb, infant mortality to fall, and the constant specter of epidemic disease to recede. The labor movement, despite fierce opposition, gradually gained strength. Workers organized, struck, demanded better conditions and higher wages. The Match Girls' strike of 1888, when the women of the Bryant and May Match Factory walked out to protest their abysmal working conditions, and the phossy jaw that was killing them, caught public attention and sympathy in a way that forced change. The dock strike of 1889 showed that even unskilled laborers could organize effectively. Slowly, painfully, workers gained rights and protections. Political reforms gradually extended the franchise, giving working men and eventually women the vote. With political power came the ability to demand change through the ballot box, rather than through violence or pleading. The growth of trade unions, the formation of the Labour Party, the expansion of education, all contributed to a slow but real improvement in the lives of ordinary people. But the improvements came too late for millions. Too late for the children who died before their first birthday. Too late for the workers crushed by machinery or killed by industrial disease. Too late for those who drank contaminated water and died of cholera. Too late for all those who suffered and died in the decades when London was both the richest city on earth and one of the deadliest places a human being could live. Why this matters now. You might be wondering why we've spent this time together walking through the nightmare of Victorian London. After all, we live in a very different world now. We have clean water, safe food, regulated workplaces, health care, social safety nets. The horrors of the Industrial Revolution seemed distant, almost unreal, like something from another planet rather than just another time. But the truth is that Industrial Revolution London isn't as far away as we might like to think. The forces that created those conditions, the prioritization of profit over human well-being, the willingness to sacrifice workers for efficiency, the acceptance of environmental destruction as a necessary cost of progress, these forces still exist in our world. In many parts of the globe today, people work in conditions that would be entirely familiar to a Victorian factory worker. Garment workers in Bangladesh toil 16-hour days in unsafe buildings that collapse and kill hundreds. Electronics workers in China breathe toxic fumes and handle dangerous materials for poverty wages. Children in cobalt mines in the Congo work in conditions that would have seemed at home in a Victorian coal mine. The environmental destruction we've inflicted on our planet, the poisoning of our air and water, the sacrifice of irreplaceable ecosystems for short-term profit, these would be grimly recognizable to someone who lived through the Great Stink or watched the Thames become an open sewer. We've simply exported much of our pollution and toxic industry to places where people have less power to resist, where regulations are weaker or non-existent, where the human cost of our consumption is hidden from our view. The lesson of Victorian London is not that things inevitably get better. Things got better because people fought to make them better, because workers organized and demanded change, because journalists exposed the horrors and shocked the public conscience, because reformers in government pushed through legislation against fierce opposition, because scientists and engineers develop solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems. The systems we have today, the clean water, the food safety regulations, the workplace protections, the health care, none of it was given freely. All of it was fought for, demanded, built piece by people who refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. Victorian London also teaches us about resilience. The people who lived through those conditions, who got up every morning and breathed the poison air and drank the dangerous water and went to work in the death trap factories, they were no different from us. They weren't stronger or braver or more capable of enduring suffering. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship, and they survived because they had no choice but to survive, because they had families who depended on them, because they had hopes for a better future, even when that future seemed impossibly distant. There's also a lesson here about privilege and perspective. If you're watching this video, you have access to technology that would have seemed like magic to a Victorian. You have comforts and securities that even the wealthiest Victorian could barely imagine. You can drink water from a tap without fearing death. You can eat food without wondering if it's been adulterated with poison. You likely work in conditions that are incomparably safer than any Victorian workplace. You have access to medical care that could cure diseases that were death sentences in the 1800s. This isn't meant to minimize whatever struggles you face in your own life. Modern life has its own challenges, its own anxieties, its own forms of suffering. But it is worth pausing occasionally to recognize how much of what we take for granted was won through the suffering and struggle of those who came before us. The ease of our lives was built on their sacrifice. And finally, Victorian London reminds us that progress is not inevitable and not irreversible. The protections we have, the clean air and water, the workplace safety, the food regulations, all of it requires constant vigilance to maintain. There are always forces pushing to weaken regulations, to prioritize profit over safety, to accept environmental destruction as a cost of doing business. The fight that Victorian reformers began is not over. It continues in every generation, in every society. We honor the memory of those who suffered and died in Industrial Revolution London, not by simply feeling grateful for our better circumstances, but by continuing their work, by demanding clean air and water for everyone, not just those who can afford to live in unpolluted areas, by insisting on safe workplaces and fair wages, by supporting regulations that protect public health even when they limit corporate profits, by remembering that economic systems exist to serve human needs, not the other way around. The Victorian era showed us what happens when society prioritizes industrial growth and profit above all else, when human beings are treated as nothing more than cogs in an economic machine, when the wealthy and powerful are allowed to externalize the costs of their prosperity onto the poor and powerless. The results were catastrophic: poisoned air and water, destroyed health, shortened lives, endless suffering. We live in a world that still faces these temptations, that still sometimes treats people as disposable, that still sacrifices long-term well-being for short-term gain. The story of Industrial Revolution London is a warning about what happens when we make those choices, and a reminder of what it takes to build something better. The people who lived through Victorian London's worst years didn't know they were living through a temporary horror that would eventually improve. For many of them, the world they knew was the only world they could imagine, but they kept going. They raised their children as best they could. They supported each other through grief and hardship. They organized and agitated and demanded change. And slowly, painfully, over decades, they built a better world. We are the inheritors of their struggle. We live in the world they helped create, a world incomparably better than the one they knew, though still far from perfect. We owe them our gratitude, but more than that, we owe them our commitment to continuing the work they began, to building a world where no one has to choose between earning a living and breathing clean air, where children don't die from preventable diseases, where work doesn't destroy the worker, where progress means lifting everyone up, not grinding the unfortunate down. The echo across time. Before we part ways and you return to your comfortable present, take one more walk with me through those Victorian streets. Feel the cobblestones beneath your feet, worn smooth by countless tired footsteps. Smell the coal smoke, thick enough to taste. Hear the coughs of the factory workers, the cries of street vendors, the endless noise of a city consuming itself in the furnace of industry. Now, imagine the faces of the people you pass, the young mother carrying her sick baby, hoping against hope that this won't be the illness that takes her child. The old man, barely 50 but looking 70, his body broken by decades of brutal labor, the child chimney sweep, his lungs already filling with soot, his growth stunted by malnutrition. The factory girl with her bandaged hands, heading to another 16-hour shift. The clerk in his threadbare suit, maintaining the appearance of respectability while slowly starving. These weren't statistics or historical abstractions. They were people as real as you, with hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments. They loved and laughed and cried. They told jokes and sang songs. They fell in love and raised families. They did all the things that humans do, but they did it while fighting every single day just to survive in a world that was actively hostile to their existence. And yet, in the midst of all this suffering, there was also community. Neighbors who shared what little they had when someone was sick. The old woman who would watch the children so mothers could work. The workers who would contribute a few pennies each to help a colleague who'd been injured. The street musicians who brought moments of beauty to the darkness. The churches and charitable organizations that, whatever their flaws, did try to ease suffering where they could. Human kindness persisted even in the worst conditions. People found ways to celebrate, to mark births and marriages and holidays, to create moments of joy and connection amid the grinding hardship. This too is part of the story of Victorian London. This resilience of the human spirit, this refusal to be completely crushed by even the most oppressive circumstances. The transformation of London from the hellish city of 1858 to the modern metropolis we know today is one of the great success stories of social progress. It didn't happen quickly or easily. It took decades of struggle, of setbacks and victories, of brave people standing up to powerful interests and demanding change. But it did happen. The poisonous air was cleaned. The deadly water was purified. The death trap factories were made safer. The adulterated food was regulated. The diseases were conquered or controlled. Life expectancy climbed. Infant mortality fell. The great city that had been killing its people found ways to sustain them instead. This transformation wasn't inevitable. It required deliberate choices, political will, massive investment in infrastructure, and fundamental changes in how society thought about its responsibilities to its members. It required recognizing that economic progress that came at the cost of human suffering was not true progress at all. It required understanding that a society is judged not by the wealth of its richest members, but by the well-being of its poorest. These lessons remain relevant because the fundamental challenges haven't changed. How do we balance economic development with environmental protection? How do we ensure that the benefits of progress are shared broadly rather than concentrated in few hands? How do we protect workers without stifling innovation? How do we regulate business without crushing entrepreneurship? How do we care for those who can't care for themselves without creating dependency? Victorian London doesn't give us easy answers to these questions, but it does provide stark examples of what happens when we get the balance wrong, when we prioritize profits over people, when we treat the environment as an infinite resource to be exploited, when we abandon the vulnerable to their fate. The ghosts of Victorian London still walk among us, not in any supernatural sense, but in the ongoing struggles over these same issues. When we debate environmental regulations, we're having the same argument that Victorians had about whether it was acceptable for factories to poison the air. When we discuss workplace safety rules, we're revisiting the question of whether it's acceptable to sacrifice workers for efficiency. When we argue about healthcare and social services, we're asking the same questions about social responsibility that the Victorians wrestled with. The difference is that we now have the benefit of history. We can look back at Victorian London and see clearly what worked and what didn't, what made things better and what made them worse. We don't have to repeat their mistakes. We don't have to learn the same lessons through the same suffering. We can choose differently because we know better. But knowledge isn't enough. It takes will. It takes courage to stand up to powerful interests and demand change. It takes persistence to keep fighting when progress seems impossibly slow. It takes solidarity to stand with those whose suffering we might not directly experience. It takes imagination to envision better alternatives to the status quo. The Victorians who reformed London had all of these qualities. They faced ridicule, opposition, setbacks, failures. They were told that what they wanted was impossible, too expensive, impractical, that it would ruin the economy, that the problems they identified weren't really problems at all. But they kept pushing, kept fighting, kept building, and eventually they won. We face our own challenges today, different in specifics but similar in nature. Climate change, inequality, environmental degradation, labor exploitation, these are the great struggles of our time, just as pollution, poverty, and industrial disease were the struggles of the Victorian era. How we respond to these challenges will determine what kind of world we leave to those who come after us, just as the Victorians' responses determined the world we inherited. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, in your clean, safe, comfortable bed, breathing air that won't poison you, drinking water that won't kill you, think about those who came before. Think about their struggles and their sacrifices. Think about what they endured so that you could have this comfort. And think about what you might do, in your own time and in your own way, to continue their work of building a better world. The story of Industrial Revolution London is ultimately a story about human choices. It's about the choice between prioritizing profit or people, between accepting suffering as inevitable or fighting to end it, between looking away from problems or confronting them directly. The Victorians made their choices, some good and some catastrophically bad, and we live with the consequences. Now, it's our turn to choose, and future generations will live with ours. If you found value in this journey through the dark streets of Victorian London, if this story has given you something to think about, or helped you understand our modern world a little better, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what aspect of Victorian London you found most striking or surprising. And if you have suggestions for other historical topics you'd like to explore in this same detailed way, please share them. Until next time, rest well in your safe, clean, modern world. And remember those who fought to make it that way.